We are here for the second International Philosophy Symposium organized by Ege University. And the topic is following the nature. We are in the second day. I am Emre Koyuncu, a lecturer in Ankara University, Department of Philosophy, and I will be moderating this session. We have two speakers in this session, Eylem Canaslan and Elisa Aaltola. We will begin with Eylem Canaslan. She will be speaking about neurotechnological developments and the future of the concept of human nature. Then Elisa Aaltola will be speaking about tackling climate akrasia. Can guilt and shame be morally productive? We will be listening to consecutive presentations. This is a 90-minute presentation. So we'll be listening to half an hour for each speaker. Then we will be having a half an hour question and answer session. And they will be able to ask their question. I'd like to introduce our speakers. Eylem Canaslan is a philosophy lecturer in Kırklareli University, especially focusing on modern philosophy, especially Spinoza, and she's also quite interested in philosophy of environment. And Elisa Aaltola is a lecturer in Finland, Turku University, and she is interested in physics, animal philosophy, animal studies, and especially environment, philosophy of environment. First, following the program, first I want to give floor to Eylem Canaslan. Yes, floor is yours, Eylem. Thank you very much for this organization. Both this theme and introduction is a really important event in which I am really honored to be a part. I'd like to thank the Ege University Department of Philosophy, the organizing committee, and Professor Koyuncu, and especially Emre. Thank you very much too for your moderation. I'm speaking about the neurotechnological developments and the future of the concept of human nature.
Dear participants, the author of the second presentation is Elisa Aaltola. She is a faculty member at the University of Turku in Finland, specializing in ethics, animal philosophy, and environmental philosophy. Her presentation's title today is, let me check it again. Where is it? I lost my screen. Yeah, I just lost my screen. Climate Akrasia. Maybe I should just skip repeating the title. She can read the title herself if she wants. So, dear Aaltola, please go ahead. We are looking forward to listening to your presentation.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to speak at your conference. Yes, I'm Elisa Aaltola, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Turku in Finland in the philosophy unit. And I will today be talking about climate shame and whether climate shaming is morally permissible. And so in the initial title, there was also the word Akrasia, but I will skip Akrasia in this talk and I will go straight into the issue of shaming. And I will be showing my screen. And also, just a head up that this is something that I have been working on, and there is an article that you can find where I discuss this same issue. In fact, 2 articles, and also on my webpage you will find my books and my articles on animal philosophy and environmental philosophy, and also moral psychology, in case you are interested. And I will now start sharing my screen. So the title is, Can Climate Shame Be Morally Productive? A few years ago, the Swedish press began to talk about a new phenomenon, flight shame. It referred to the shame felt by those who take unnecessary flights and thereby add to the carbon load warming our planet. Since then, also flight shaming has become a phenomenon, as some have actively sought to name and shame, for instance, those celebrities who fly their private jets without concern for the environment. On a more general level, climate shame and shaming are rising social phenomena. Awareness of the anthropogenic climate crisis forces us to reconsider who we are as people, as individuals, on this warming planet, and how we may be partly to blame for the crisis. Indeed, environmental advocates such as Greta Thunberg have at times actively used shaming, particularly of those with most power and wealth, as a method of raising awareness on climate change. But is what I will call climate shame a constructive emotion from the viewpoint of morality? Should we climate shame ourselves and others? Should we cause shame in the surrounding society? These are the central questions of this talk. One of the ways in which shame is typically differentiated from guilt concerns the distinction between actions and selfhood. Whereas guilt focuses on specific actions, shame focuses on one's self. Thereby, in the grips of shame, we feel as if our whole self is somehow faulty and ruined. This entwines with another difference between these two emotions. Whilst guilt revolves around primarily moral matters, therefore we can undergo guilt even if nobody else knows of our wrongdoing, shame is a primarily social emotion, rooted in how others perceive us. Therefore, we can undergo shame when others judge us, even when we have done nothing wrong. So in this sense, guilt and shame are even quite oppositional. They are the opposites of each other. This again paves the way for painful psychological consequences. If we feel that our whole self is a failure, exposed to the public sphere, it takes a very stoic person not to feel at least some amount of anguish. Indeed, shame has been argued to be psychologically much more painful than guilt, as studies show that shame includes feelings of worthlessness, insignificance, and helplessness. The painfulness of shame stems partly from its connections to social rejection and the perceived invalidity of our selfhood. As argued by the psychologist Paul Gilbert, selfhood is partly founded on social acceptance, and when such acceptance is replaced by criticism and rejection, the effective emotive consequences can be deeply disturbing. Next to being profoundly unpleasant, even tormenting emotion, shame has been linked to various mental disorders and challenges, such as the narcissistic personality disorder, eating disorders, anxiety, depression, and trauma. Thereby, shame can be a profoundly painful emotion that may diminish also our overall mental and psychological well-being. Because of this, many hold a negative view on shame. As an emotion, it feels deeply unpleasant and even intolerably painful. It wrenches our body, makes us want to run, hide, and never return. Shame hurts to a degree that it can make some individuals even want to kill or die. The philosopher Simone Weil argued that recognizing how limited, faulty, and insignificant we are as individuals, the core feature of shame, is the worst kind of suffering a human being can undergo. There is truth to Weil's claim. For social creatures such as human beings, shame is an inherently tormenting state that can push us into the shadowy crevices of desperation. The above means that also climate shame may be psychologically deeply distressing. Climate shaming may potentially even lead to psychological symptoms such as depression and generally poor mental well-being, and be damaging to psychological health. Because of this, climate shame, and particularly shaming, can be criticized on moral grounds. Shame tends to have a bad reputation in Western cultures. It is frequently positioned as an inherently negative emotion. Accordingly, the intentional causing of shame is often depicted as morally impermissible. As an example, scholars exploring body shaming have called it psychological abuse, thereby highlighting both its afflictive consequences and its immoral nature. Also, climate shaming has been criticized on similar grounds, even by some climate scientists. The argument is simple. If shame feels intolerable and thereby causes psychological distress and harm to those feeling it, shaming in itself is a violent act amounting to abuse. This means that also climate shaming is a morally troubling action, something that we should avoid. However, the moral status of shaming is not societally straightforward, for in some contexts, shaming is largely accepted and even endorsed. One recent example is the Me Too movement, which has used public shaming as a tool of societal change. The same applies to climate shaming, as for instance the British newspaper The Guardian has argued flight shame to be a force of good. Indeed, shaming is a widespread phenomenon that has both negative and positive implications. Although stocks and other similar methods of public shaming are long gone, media, and particularly social media, have invented new ways of shaming and arguably make frequent use of them. Therefore, whilst contemporary cultures view stocks and shaming bells with horror, they use their own form of public shaming to achieve the same purpose, deterring people away from norm violations and actions that the society deems reprehensible. Therefore, although, for instance, body shaming is seen as unacceptable, the shaming used in the Me Too movement has been largely condoned, even embraced, which suggests that there are instances of shaming that are perceived to lack moral justification, and instances that are, on the contrary, deemed morally justifiable and even necessary. The central question, therefore, is which category should climate shaming belong to? Now, to make matters more complicated, besides having psychological and even physiological costs, because psychological distress causes also physiological ailments, shame also potentially comes with moral costs. The philosophers Krista Thomasson and Heidi Maiboom have pointed out that due to its dependence on social rather than moral matters, shame can even motivate immoral actions, as the ashamed desperately tries to avoid social damnation by resorting to illicit means. In short, since shame prioritizes social rather than moral issues, it can lead one to overlook the latter in favor of the former, whereby individuals are ready to do almost anything in order to escape shame. Because of this, shame often leads to defensive behaviors, such as withdrawal and anger, which make it morally counterproductive. In a state of withdrawal, the ashamed individual avoids those people and situations which cause shame. And in a state of anger, he directs aggression towards oneself and others. Now, also in the context of climate shaming, shame may spark defensive behaviors which have morally destructive consequences. Instead of shame leading the individual to give up climate harming practices, it may lead her to avoid all climate related information and get furious with climate advocates. Such defenses can lead to less than morally constructive consequences, as withdrawal amounts to wholesale denial and avoidance of environmental issues, and as anger manifests as outright destructive fury directed against climate scientists and advocates, or anybody who speaks on behalf of better climate policies. Greta Thunberg stands out as the pivotal and most famous example of such defensive reactions. After she started school strikes in Stockholm in order to raise awareness on climate change, she has been mocked and insulted in various ways, whether it be on the basis of her looks, sexual appeal, or even mental status. And I should emphasize, as a child, she was mocked for these reasons. She was insulted in deeply problematic ways, and the critics seem to forget that she indeed was a child. Even world leaders, including Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro, took part in mocking this environmentalist child or teenager. Strikingly, a young, vulnerable woman was subjected to public verbal abuse by powerful older men. Thunberg's crime was that she caused shame. This is the reason of those aggressive, furious, defensive attacks on her. Thunberg is famous for her 2019 United Nations speech, where she directly and explicitly shamed world leaders, asking them, "How dare you?" Ultimately, the manner in which Thunberg shamed the elite was even named as one reason for why she did not receive the Nobel Peace Prize that same year, even though she was nominated for it. And this was named as one reason for also the attacks she received. It is not difficult to read this event as a typical yet well-known example of how shame can lead to defensiveness. It seems likely that many of Thunberg's critics felt shame for their environmentally destructive actions and choices, and that their immature actions and attacks on Thunberg were defenses against such shame. In short, they mocked Thunberg because she had dared to publicly criticize them and thereby had caused them to become aware of their shame. Although Thunberg is right in her message, the world leaders and the financial elite are responsible for both climate crisis and the Anthropocene with its environmental destruction and harm done to non-human animals. Her method of communicating it may therefore be criticized for having less than morally desired consequences. The implication is that climate shaming risks inviting immoral actions, such as defensive behaviors with morally destructive consequences, including aggression toward those who speak of the climate crisis. The danger of defensiveness is particularly strong in this polarized era in which many approach moral issues through the lens of identity, political ideology, and tribal thinking, thereby getting ever more prone towards conflict and shame. In sum, it is appropriate to feel shame over the climate crisis, but if that merely causes unnecessary and unproductive suffering, or even worse, steers people further away from morally constructive behavior and leads them into destructive behaviors, climate shaming as an intentional act does not appear to be morally justified. However, there are also good reasons to argue that Thunberg might have gotten it right. There are reasons to argue that climate shaming can have morally constructive consequences next to these defensive behaviors. Indeed, some classic thinkers have positioned shame in general as a necessary part of developing moral agency, and thereby we can also argue that climate shame is a necessary part of becoming more moral in our understanding and attitudes and actions concerning the non-human nature and its beings. Already Plato and Aristotle emphasized shame's power to teach us virtue and make us more moral. Plato argued that shame facilitates moral cultivation. In all of its unpleasantness, shame teaches us to avoid base and wrong things and to strive towards that which is beautiful and good. Shame is a method of learning morality, as the claim is that humans come to recognize what is good by reflecting on what is shameful. Aristotle had a very similar take on shame. He argued that shame makes us fearful of appearing dishonorable to others, and thereby it teaches us to strive toward honor and respectability, and in so doing teaches us morality. Simply stated, because we wish not to be looked down upon by others, we seek to adhere to social norms, which again helps us to internalize the ethics of our societies and become capable moral agents. This positive take on shame's moral potential is supported by many contemporary philosophers. For instance, Krista Thomason maintains that shame can motivate moral change, as we wish to live up to the ideal that we have failed. In a similar vein, Gabriel Taylor has claimed that shame results in the loss of self-respect, and since most of us wish to regain that respect, shame spurs and motivates us towards transformation. Other philosophers to advocate shame's moral potential include Bernard Williams and David Velleman, who similarly argue that the wish to reach our ideals concerning who we are renders shame into a morally productive emotion. We want to become a person who can reach the ideals set upon us by ourselves and the society. In the context of climate shame and shaming, this would mean that individuals who know that they have failed to live up to the ideals of how a person should treat the non-human nature and animals wish to amend the situation by finally putting those ideals into practice. They may do so because they do not want to be judged and criticized by others, whereby the yearning for social acceptance will spur them to become more environmentally aware. They may also do so because they realize they will lose self-respect if they continue their old harmful ways. As an end result, climate shame and shaming can act as pedagogic methods in curtailing environmental destruction. Climate shame can urge us to give better regard to non-human nature and non-human animals. So therefore, perhaps Thunberg indeed was right. Perhaps we should climate shame others, and perhaps climate shame is a deeply constructive moral emotion. But what about the psychological toll this has on people? Interestingly, it is precisely because shame feels so unpleasant that it holds moral pedagogic power. According to various scholars, the evolutionary function of shame is found from its ability to entice one to follow social norms. When we, as social animals, undergo a sense of social rejection, the associated negative feelings help us to avoid those behaviors that lead to rejection in the future. Thereby, the more distressing shame feels, the more potently it fulfills its evolutionary function. Contemporary cultures often deem negative, uncomfortable feelings as something to be avoided, but perhaps this reveals a shortfall in those cultures rather than in shame. Indeed, following Plato's and Aristotle's lead, if we wish to cultivate our moral character, arguably we ought to strengthen our ability to tolerate and learn also from shame and other negative emotions, even and particularly when they sting. Applied to climate shaming, it is precisely when it hurts that it also yields constructive consequences by persuading individuals to reconsider their ways of treating the non-human world. And what about defensive behaviors such as avoidance or rage? Further, surely shame as a profoundly social emotion often interlaces with bad faith, whereby we uncritically follow social norms, regardless of whether they are morally sound or not. In the context of climate shame, these challenges would mean that those ashamed of their way of treating the non-human world may still lash out in less than constructive ways, and in their avoidance, fury, and aggression, whilst their shame can be sparked less by genuine moral concern for the environment and more by social acceptance. These are serious problems, but I argue that they can be addressed by focusing on how individuals make sense of shame. It has been claimed that in order for shame to be morally productive, the ashamed individual must master what is called moral maturity. In a state of moral maturity, we reflect on the causes of our shame and calmly consider the best ways to act upon the shame-causing norms, which helps us to avoid defensiveness. It also helps to lessen bad faith, as a morally mature individual critically examines why she wants to adhere to given social norms and rejects those shame-inducing expectations that lack moral justification. Ideally, climate shame is met with such moral maturity, which helps individuals ashamed of their prior actions towards and beliefs concerning the environment to avoid both defensive behaviors and bad faith, whilst letting shame fulfill its moral pedagogic role. In practice, this means that cultures and society should give us more tools with which to make sense of shame and come to terms with it. In other words, tools of reaching moral maturity. It appears to me that defensiveness is a sign of the current era, which contains a lot of shame and shaming, but fails to support individuals in coping with shame. This highly individualistic era is characterized by the constant search for social esteem and status, which makes us vulnerable to shame and yet leaves individuals alone in dealing with their shame. Shame is social in two ways. We feel it for social reasons, and we learn from it with the help of others. Contemporary individualistic cultures often ignore the latter dimension, which feeds defensive behaviors as the ashamed individuals are abandoned to their own devices and resort to desperate action. Therefore, society and culture should support us in becoming the sort of morally mature individuals that can face and learn from shame. This means that climate shame and shaming must be accompanied by social support. The climate advocate should not merely blame people, but also teach them how to change. I'm coming to the conclusion very briefly. Shame and shaming can, thereby, be seen as moral pedagogic tools. Sentences like, "You should be ashamed of yourself" and "shame on you" can be translated into, "You committed a moral wrong and must change your actions." Such pedagogy does not take place merely on the individual, but also on the societal level. Indeed, public shaming is routinely used in order to manifest that a wrong has been committed on the level of people, companies, institutions, and even the level of whole governments, and that these agents should change their ways. All of this applies also to climate shame and shaming. Although many contemporary cultures have seen a hedonistic tendency to avoid unpleasant and difficult emotions, and in the ethos of positive psychology, only aim towards positive experiences, the unpleasant and difficult emotions serve an important role, for instance, in helping us to learn from mistakes and to become more moral in our actions. In this vein, also climate shame can, despite its painfulness, be a valuable and indeed vital reminder of how to tread on this earth more carefully and how to take into account also non-human animals and nature. Learning how to cope with shame becomes particularly important when we notice that climate shame is rarely the result of intentional shaming. It is not always the result of somebody intentionally shaming us, but simply the consequence of learning about the climate crisis. Indeed, studies show that individuals across the political spectrum have a tendency to approach data from the climate sciences via identity, which all too easily entwines with feelings of shame, inadequacy, and/or threat. Therefore, if the mere knowledge of the climate crisis leads to feelings of shame, surely it is vital that we become better able of coping with and learning from such shame. Indeed, learning from climate shame may be necessary for consumeristic societies to finally adopt a more respectful and morally sound relationship with both non-human animals and nature. Finally, I very briefly want to return to the distinction between guilt and shame mentioned earlier. Should we not aim for climate guilt rather than shame? Climate guilt can indeed be productive. Guilt is less painful and comes with the desire for change and restitutive action, which makes it morally more productive emotion, also in the context of environmental issues, according to many scholars. However, it has been argued that shame can be morally more constructive than guilt in some instances. For instance, John Wilson has claimed that precisely because shame centers on the self, shame motivates a general change in our moral beliefs and actions. Whereas guilt frequently focuses only on one particular action, shame's focus on the whole self holds promise of igniting comprehensive change in our moral outlook and in our very worldview, and thereby it can challenge anthropocentric ideas and give us a more holistic understanding of human beings, non-human animals, and nature. To conclude, from this perspective, climate shame promises to be even more transformative than climate guilt. Whilst the latter may prompt us to fly less or consume less animal products, climate shame invites us to question who we are in relation to the non-human nature and animals, and how we as individuals should approach the world around us. As such, in the best case scenario, climate shame instigates a wholesale alteration in how we live, which allows us to finally treat the non-human world and its beings with moral care. Thank you.
Thank you, dear Elisa Aaltola. Thank you very much for your presentation. Having completed both presentations, I think we can proceed to questions and answers from participants. Feel free to write your questions in the chat window, or you can raise your hand and ask your question yourself. Okay, there are a few questions addressed to Elisa Aaltola. I will translate them, paraphrase them as much as I can. The first one is about Greta Thunberg, and in the question, İpek Özinanır, she acknowledges the efforts Greta Thunberg put into raising awareness about all the environmental damage that we as human beings create. But she is hesitant about praising Greta Thunberg because Özinaner emphasizes that she is also collaborating with certain companies who are using animal skins to produce furniture. She finds this, I think, this attitude somehow inconsistent with her general attitude, this collaboration. So she asks your opinion about this inconsistency. Would you like to answer this question, or I can accumulate a few questions for you?
Well, if I answer it straight away, so I remember.
Okay.
Yes, so my talk is not meant to comment on Thunberg in general and her ethics in general, or her as a person, but rather on whether shame and shaming are morally feasible and constructive. So that was why I brought her into this discussion. I do not know about her collaborations, and I do not mean to simply endorse her as a person, but rather use her as an example of climate shaming. But thank you for the comment.
Thank you. There are two questions. One is coming from Shukru Argan. He's asking if we can address and solve political problems that are working systematically solely on the level of individual ethics, and if a system with masked representatives who do not really have a face, and we make them ashamed of themselves if they don't really have a face to bear that shame. And he is also asking if this effort is worthy and necessary at all. So that is the first question. And the second question comes from Koyuncu. She's asking, she says, in our previous session, Özge Ejder mentioned the actions of certain climate activists who throw paint on works of art. She shared her initial reaction upon reading about these protests, admitting to a sense of anger directed at the activists, considering that these protests may trigger anger in us, not necessarily aimed at those responsible of climate change, rather at the activists themselves. Do you think these protests still retain their constructive and political motivational value?
Excellent questions. And also the previous one was excellent question. And I have to add to it that, of course, it's important to be consistent. And I myself am vegan, so I do hope that also that aspect is taken into account in environmental discussion. But as it comes to the second question, systemic change is the most obvious and important ways of critiquing individualistic moral psychology in this context. And it certainly is true that by far the largest responsibility lays on industries, political leaders, and the financial elite. Exxon Oil, for instance, has much more to answer as it comes to culpability than individuals living in the society and maybe individual flyers or other similar creatures. But at the same time, I myself think that it's a mistake. It's a kind of a false dichotomy to think that we have a system and then we have individuals and they have nothing to do with each other. systems are made of individuals in the end, and although they begin to live their own lives and they become their own constructions, individuals can still have a lot of power. And this is particularly evident in the current era when we have extremely powerful individuals such as Elon Musk or Donald Trump or Putin, who do not represent only a system. Of course, the system allowed them to gain that power, but they also represent an individual viewpoint and I would say a maligned moral psychology. And this manifests how we must combine both. We can't only think of the society as being constructed of faceless systemic entities and institutions, but also we must pay attention to the individuals who run them and the individuals who vote these people into power, the individuals who buy the things that the system has to offer and so forth. So I think that although we must place emphasis on systemic change, we must also pay emphasis on individuals. And when it comes to the latter, moral psychology is necessary. And also, as I said in my talk, we can shame companies, we can shame whole industries, we can shame world leaders and even governments. One example of this is the way in which Canadian government has apologized for given environmental transgressions, and the way in which different industries seek to purify their public image because they realize that the kind of systemic self has become attached to shame and public disapproval. So yes, I think systemic and individual change entwine, and we must pay attention to both. As it comes to the latter question, paint and environmental activism and the anger that it has caused when activists walk into art museums and throw paint on or throw sauce on the paintings. Of course, these actions didn't cause any real damage, but it did lead to fury. And I think it's important to consider whether that anger and fury is constructive in the end. Their argument is that it makes people pause and rethink the issue after the initial anger transpires. So even I felt angry at first, but then when I realized that, okay, there wasn't any real damage that took place, and when I took a few moments to reconsider the thing, it started to become apparent that they had managed to gain global attention to the environmental issues. And I think that you often don't see the results immediately. You see the anger immediately, but the actual results that might mean, for instance, moral psychological change and heightened awareness, you see on a long-term scale. And I think that we do not know yet which way the scale tips. But thank you for the questions.
I think this is the end of our session. I'd like to thank everyone who has organized the symposium. Also, I'd like to thank them for inviting me too. It was a very useful activity. I'd like to thank the speakers too for this fruitful event and fruitful session. Thanks, everyone. After half an hour, we will be having closing remarks. Özgür Soysal will be moderating the session, and we will be speaking about decolonizing ecofeminism. This will be the closing remark. Have a nice day again. See you in the closing remarks. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Eylem.
Dr. Aaltola, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.